Panel live webinar on risk management for medical devices, ISO 14971 in 2007. My name is Ron, and I'm going to be a host for today's session. On behalf of the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for being part of today's event. Today's webinar will be presented by Dan O'Leary. A few words about Dan before we could start off today's session. Dan is the president of Ombu Enterprises LLC, a company offering training and execution in operational excellence, focused on analytic skills and a systems approach to operations management. Dan has more than 30 years experience in quality, operations, and program management in regulated industries, including aviation, defense, medical devices, and clinical labs. He has a master's degree in mathematics, is an ASQ certified biomedical auditor, quality engineer, reliability engineer, and Six Sigma Black Belt, and is certified by APICS in resource management. We are honored to have such a distinguished person such as Dan with us to present today's webinar. Now, ladies and gentlemen, before we begin, I would like to inform you of the program outline for this training session. This webinar is for 75 minutes duration. First, Dan will take you through today's webinar, highlighting the areas he will be covering, and he will then share with you his presentation. I would also like to inform all participants, once you're part of this teleconference, your lines will be placed on mute and would remain so until the Q&A begins towards the end of the webinar. Now, this is for the purpose of avoiding discontinuity and for allowing the presenter to speak clearly. We also request all to hold back your questions until the Q&A window begins. 10 minutes of your time will be allotted for the Q&A, during which your questions will be answered. Now, if for any reason you get logged out of this training session or teleconference, please follow the same procedure to join in again. And now that we're all ready to start, I request Dan to take it from here. Dan?
Well, thank you very much, Ron, and welcome everyone to our session on risk management for medical devices. Now, during the session, you may have a question about a particular slide, and as we get into the presentation, there'll be a slide number on the bottom of each slide. So if you have a question about a slide, let me know the slide number, and we can go back to that and refer to it and answer your question in the appropriate context. Now, this is what we're going to talk about. This is the outline of the presentation for today. First, we're going to look at the status of ISO 14971. There's some confusion here, and I'm going to clarify that confusion for you. We're going to look at regulatory requirements because medical devices are regulated in a couple of different systems, and they have a linkage to risk management, so we're going to explore that. Then we're going to look at what's in ISO 14971 2007. Now, this is going to be a high-level approach. You're going to understand how it all fits together, but we're not going to have time to get into the specific details. There is also a guidance document on risk management from the Global Harmonization Task Force, and that's very valuable to help you understand how to implement a risk management system as part of a quality management system. That's its focus. And so we'll look at how that fits together. We're going to cover a few of the more common risk management tools. They have some value in helping you establish your risk management system. So we're just going to give you a brief introduction to some of the tools that are mentioned in ISO 14971. And we'll do summary and conclusions, and then we'll open it up for questions. All right, so let's look at the current status of ISO 14971 2007. So it is the second edition, and it replaces the previous edition and an amendment. So it was published on March 1st, 2007, and it comes from ISO. So this is the international standard. So this is not the standard that is used in any given country or region. The standards in countries and regions are based upon this standard, but this is the international standard. So it's managed by ISO TC 210, and they deal with a lot of quality aspects of medical devices. So that's where the expertise lies. Now, it's recognized by FDA, as well as the U.S. version. So FDA recognized the current version on August 20th, 2012 for all medical devices, including 510Ks, PMAs, IDEs, which are investigational device exemptions, PDPs, and HDEs, humanitarian device exemptions. And they recognize the whole standard. And oddly enough, FDA has not published any guidance documents about 14971 at this time. Now, there is, in the European Union, this concept of harmonized standards. And harmonized standards in the European Union have a particular legal status. And when the European Union issues a standard, they put the letters EN in front of it as a prefix. So the harmonized version is EN ISO 14971-2012. Now, the EN tells us that it's the European version of the standard, and it's built upon the international version, ISO 14971, but it includes information specific to the product directives in the European Union. And there was a major change in the European Union's view of the relationship of risk management and the product directives, and that caused the 2012 version to become harmonized. Now, there was the 2009 version before that, and conformity ended on August 30th, 2012. So if you are selling your medical device in the European Union, you have to follow the European Union harmonized version. If you're selling your medical device in the whole rest of the world, then you do not have to follow the European Union harmonized version. And so there has been a lot of confusion about the fact that the European Union version came out in 2012, but the international version hasn't changed. It's still the 2007 version. So here's the picture of what's going on in the European Union. So as I said, many of the European Union standards start with the ISO version, and then they have particular changes related to the things that are going on in the EU relative to the product directives, and that's what happened here. So the European Union adopted the 2007 international version, essentially unchanged. They had to make a few technical adjustments, and so they came out with the 2009 version. And then they had to make these major changes in which they were identifying discrepancies between the standard, the international version of the standard, and the product directives, and that's the 2012 version that everyone is concerned with today. Now, these are standards are published by an organization in the EU called CEN, C-E-N. They publish the standards, they develop them, publish them, but they don't sell them. You have to buy them through a local standards organization. And when you do, the local standards organization, one for each country in essence, puts their own prefix in front of it. So IS is for Irish standards, DIN is for German standards, BS is for British standards. So if you buy the standard, it'll have this additional prefix in front of it, depending upon the country where you buy it. All right, so the important point here is that the international version is ISO 14971. That's the version for use in the United States and Canada. There is a different version for use in the European Union, EN ISO 14971-2012. We're going to talk about the international version today, not the European Union version. All right, now there are links to regulatory requirements, so we're going to explore how this fits into a quality management system. Now, FDA publishes the Quality System Regulation, and it is required for all medical devices sold in the United States, regardless of where they're manufactured. So if a medical device is manufactured in Germany and sold in the United States, the German manufacturer has to follow the FDA regulations. And so FDA regulations require risk assessment as part of design validation, and that means establishing by objective evidence that device specifications conform with user needs and intended use. So what this means is you want to make sure that as part of your validation that you understand your user needs, the intended use of your device, and that you demonstrate that you meet the user needs and intended use. And the user needs are medical devices that are safe and effective. And so this is why risk management is in design validation in the FDA regulations, because it is part of the work that you do to demonstrate that your device is safe and effective. And it tends to focus more on the safe side than on the effectiveness side, but that's why it's in design validation in FDA QSR. Now, in 1345, it's in a different place. It's in product realization, and the requirement there is risk management throughout product realization. You have to maintain records, and 1345, which is the quality management system that's used in the vast majority of the world outside of the United States, recommends using ISO 14971 for guidance related to risk management. So the issue here is that the issue here is that 1345 is used, for example, in the European Union. And so if you have a medical device that's manufactured in the United States and sold in Germany, you have to follow the German regulations, which are going to require you to do some version of ISO 1345. So that's the issue that's going on here. And then there's another interesting idea. Clause 7.3.2 says that risk management outputs become design and development inputs. Now, what this means is that as you work on risk management, you're going to do something to the product to reduce its risk. And we're going to look at some of those risk reduction methodologies. Every time you do something to reduce the product risk, the medical device risk, that is going to produce an output from the risk management process, which is going to double back in as an input into the design control process. And so this is going to be one of the ways in which these standards get linked. Now that we understand where 14971 fits in the regulatory structure of the quality management systems, we're going to look at 14971 itself. So I'm going to give you an overview. I'm going to show you how all the pieces fit together. But as I said at the beginning, there's a lot of things going on in this standard, and so we're not going to have time to get into all of the details. Now, this is a major flow of how the risk management standard fits together. So the first thing you're going to do is develop a risk management plan. And the plan is described in Clause 3.4 of the standard. Then, utilizing the information in the risk management plan, you're now going to start to execute the plan. And the first thing you're going to look at is risk analysis. Now, risk analysis is going to start with a certain point, a hazard, and it's going to follow it until we get to harm that could be caused to users or patients or the environment. And then we're going to estimate the risk associated with each one of those harms. And so the output of risk analysis, is the individual estimate of risk. And then we're going to ask the question, is the risk acceptable? So we've developed in the risk management plan our acceptability criteria, so now we're going to evaluate our estimated risk from risk analysis against the requirements in the risk management plan and make a decision about whether or not we need to control the risks. If we do need to control the risks, we're going to follow the methodology in Clause 6, which tells us how to do risk control. Then when we're done, we're going to look at the overall residual risk. So we're going to evaluate it against the criteria that's in our risk management plan, different set of criteria. And then finally, we're going to produce a risk management report. And the risk management report basically says that we followed everything we said we were going to do in the risk management plan. And now we can release the device, assuming all the other work is done, we can release the device for distribution. And we're going to enter a production and post-production information phase. So Clause 9 is going to tell us how to collect production and post-production information. All right, now what's in the risk management plan? So that's on this slide. And as I said, there has to be a plan for the risk management activities, and the plan has to have some standard elements. So these are what are required in ISO 14971 to be in the risk management plan. So first of all, you have to define the scope of the risk management activities. And the scope needs to identify the life cycle of the medical device that you're dealing with. You have to understand the responsibility and authority of people that are in the project. You have to review the requirements for risk management. In other words, this is going to be some kind of risk management review, and it's usually associated with the corresponding design review. You're going to have risk acceptability criteria, so you're going to have to define what is acceptable risk for your company, and we'll talk about how to do that. You're going to implement things in terms of changes you make, and you need to do verification of those changes that you made. So there's a risk verification element. You're going to collect production information after you release this to production, and you're going to collect post-production information after you start to put the device on the market. So you're going to define all of these steps in the risk management plan. Now, the risk management file is where all of the risk management documentation resides. And so these are quality records. They're usually going to be maintained in a risk management file. And I've got a picture here of a 4-drawer filing cabinet all full of paper. You're going to collect a lot of documentation in this process. So I generally think of it as a mental model of this filing cabinet that contains all of this information. Today, it's more likely going to be electronic documents that are usually going to be in different formats, text files, spreadsheets, whatever. What's really important is that you know where they are and you can readily retrieve them when necessary. And one of the places it's going to be necessary is if you have an FDA inspection or a notified body audit, they are going to ask you for all of this documentation in your risk management file. All right, now what's going on here with risk analysis? In Clause 4, we're going to document the intended use and the foreseeable misuse of the device. So we're going to understand both of those, and the standard has some checklists and help aids to help you understand what's going on here. Then we're going to identify known and foreseeable hazards associated with the device. And then for every hazardous situation, we're going to estimate the risk. So here's what's going to happen. We're going to identify hazards. We'll define that in a bit. And every hazard then is going to have associated with a sequence of events which leads to a hazardous situation. If a person, the user or patient, for example, is exposed to the hazardous situation, then they're going to get harm. And we're going to understand harm by combining severity and probability. And we're going to have some method established in advance that tells us how to combine severity and probability and use that to estimate the risk. And then from there, we're going to determine which one of those risk estimates are acceptable, and they're going to be part of risk evaluation. So that's what's going on in risk analysis. And then in risk evaluation, we're going to ask the question, based upon our estimate of risk and the criteria we've established in the risk management plan, do we need to do risk reduction? So we're going to evaluate every hazardous situation and its associated harm individually against the criteria in the risk management plan to answer the risk reduction question. If it is required, we're going to follow a certain path and do a number of steps. If it's not required, we're going to bypass all those steps and go to Clause 6.7. So here's a very simple example. The risk management plan defines 5 risk levels, 1 to 5, shows you how to calculate them using severity and probability. And then your acceptability criteria says that any risk of level 4 or 5 needs to be reduced to a risk of level 1, 2, or 3. So that's going to introduce risk reduction. So your acceptability criteria says that levels 1, 2, and 3 are going to be okay. Levels 4 and 5, you have to apply risk reduction methodology. Now, this is an overview of what's going on in the whole standard. And so what we did or I shouldn't say the whole standard, but the vast majority of it. What we did was we did risk analysis. So we have hazardous situations identified. They lead to risk, which is described by probability and severity of harm. We estimate probability and severity of harm, combine them in our established manner to estimate risk, and then in risk evaluation we ask the question, do I need to reduce the risk, yes or no? If the answer is yes, I'm going to do that through option analysis, and I'm going to tell you what the options are. And then in each one of those cases, I'm going to ask whether or not risk reduction is practicable. If it is, I'm going to implement it, and when I implement it, I'm going to have some risk left over. That's called residual risk. I'm going to ask whether or not the final residual risk, after I've implemented all the options, or at least gotten, after I've implemented all the options, whether or not the residual risk in this case is acceptable. If the answer is yes, I'm going to move on. If the answer is no, then I'm going to justify the issue here by looking at risk-benefit analysis. In other words, I'm going to ask the question, what is the benefit of this medical device, and does the benefit associated with this hazard, does the benefit outweigh the risk? If the answer is yes, the benefit outweighs the risk, then I'm going to move on. If not, I've got some major decisions to make because I have a very risky device without adequate benefit to justify the risk. So let's assume we get into one of these issues where everything is going to move forward, and now we're going to ask the question, have I introduced any new risks as a result of all of the work that I've done? Now I'm finally going to go through a completeness check of all of the stuff that I've looked at, and then I'm going to move on to looking at overall residual risk. Now, if I don't have to do risk reduction, then I'm just going to move directly to the completeness check box. So those are the two paths that I have. Now, overall residual risk evaluation is in Clause 7. The risk management plan is going to define risk evaluation criteria for overall risk. And if I've implemented all of the risk control measures and verified and validated them, I'm going to now review the overall risk. If the overall risk is unacceptable, I'm going to do another risk-benefit analysis. Then finally, in Clause 8, I've been through all of this activity. I've identified all of the hazards, estimated the risk, done all of the risk reduction, evaluated overall residual risk, and now I'm going to say, am I done? Have I done everything that I was supposed to do? Have I followed the risk management plan? And are the subsequent activities in place and ready to go? So this is a review of the overall risk management process, and I'm going to document the review in the risk management report. So prior to releasing the device, I'm going to ask, did I implement everything in the risk management plan? Is my overall residual risk acceptable? Are there measures in place to obtain production and post-production information and to act upon it? So I'm going to look explicitly for those three things, and I'm going to document them in the report. So this is the review that I'm going to conduct. The results go into the risk management report, which is then put into the risk management file. Now I'm going to enter the production and post-production information phase. So this is described in Clause 9 of the standard. So I'm going to collect information about the device in the production phase, and I'm going to look in particular at a couple of areas. I'm going to review acceptance data. So if I make the device, I'm going to have acceptance activities at various stages. In QSR, I'm actually going to produce a device history record. And so I'm going to ask the question, have I done everything that I was supposed to do? And I'm really going to look, in this case, at how I handle non-conforming product, because I have made an assumption that I'm shipping conforming product. But if I have non-conforming product and I have a use-as-is disposition or some other dispositions where it may not be as fully as my specifications were, I've got a potential risk. So I want to go find those to make sure that they're going to be acceptable. I also want to look quite closely at validated processes and their controls. what happens in a validated process is that you cannot verify the output of the process, and so as a result, you have to control the process to make sure it makes conforming material by controlling its input parameters. What this means is that you're shipping product that you cannot check. And because you can't check it, there is a lot of risk associated with that. And what you want to do is make sure that all of those validated processes operate correctly. So there's a couple of areas that you want to focus on for production information. For post-production, you want to look in a couple of other areas. Installation and servicing. So if you install the device or you service the device, then you're going to generate installation reports and service reports. What's going on? Are we identifying potential risks? Are we finding nonconformities? You have to have a system of complaints in both QSR and 1345. So you need to evaluate every complaint, or at least some kind of analysis of the complaints, against the requirements that you set in the risk management standard, risk management project, to make sure that you are not seeing complaints that are demonstrating that the risk that you estimated is not being achieved, that in fact it's worse. How about new and revised standards? You used a lot of standards as part of your design. If there are new or revised standards, do they have an impact on risk management? And then public information, what about other medical devices? So in the U.S., you can look at the MOD report or the Total Product Lifecycle report, and you can learn a lot of information about other companies' medical devices. In the European Union, you have a lot of organizations publish field safety notices, and so you can look at field safety notices for similar devices as well. And that happens in the European Union. There's a corresponding system in Canada, corresponding system in Australia. And so there's some English-speaking places that you can get information. Now, we're going to look at an example as we explore this. This example is called the neonatal heel stick. And it's interesting because I'm going to use it as an example to explore 14971 a little bit more. So neonates are babies that are 1 month of age or less, and they're routinely tested for metabolic diseases. And the way the system works is a nurse or a phlebotomist is going to draw a sample of blood from the baby's heel using a lancet, drip it onto filter paper, allow it to dry, and then the dried blood spot goes off to a laboratory for testing. So this is called neonatal screening. And the problem is that neonates are little babies, less than a month old. They don't have great blood flow. They squirm and wiggle a lot. So it's really hard to do the heel stick procedure on some babies. So one technique to get the blood flowing in the heel is to warm up the baby's foot. So warm up the baby's heel. And a common technique these days is this chemical pack. So this picture shows what's going on with a chemical pack. And so it's a standard chemical pack. You squeeze it together. It releases energy. It warms up to a certain temperature and then cools back down again. When it warms up the baby's heel at the same time, causing increased blood flow, and then you take it off. There's a little Velcro strip that goes across the instep. You take it off the baby and put it in, and then do the heel stick procedure and collect the blood, and that's what this picture shows. So the baby is bleeding through the heel, little drops of blood. You're collecting them in those circles on that piece of paper. This is a special filter paper. The filter paper holds the blood dries, and then all the rest of it is the demographic information. All of the stuff you want to know about the baby, name, age, hospital, gender, weight, all of that kind of stuff. All right, so then this gets folded over and goes to the lab, and the lab elutes it and tests it for these metabolic diseases. Now, we're interested in the infant heel warmer because that's a medical device. And so early in 2009, FDA published a note identifying some problems with the infant heel warmer. So here's the description. It's an instant heel pack. It's an instant chemical heat pack designed to increase circulation in the baby's heel for blood collection. It's a non-sterile, this is important words here, it's a non-sterile, single-use, disposable device with non-toxic material inside it. When it's activated, it warms up to 104 degrees Fahrenheit for the first few minutes and then cools off again. In the U.S., it's a Class 1 device, but oddly enough, it's a Class 1 device that if its intended use is for infants, it requires a 510K. So if the intended use is for infants, here's a Class 1 device that is required to have a 510K. So this is an interesting exception to the general rule. Now, what kinds of problems did FDA describe? So there's 4 cases here. An infant suffered second and third degree burns requiring treatment. What went wrong here is that the nurse wrapped the baby's heel in a blanket. And so consequently, the heat couldn't dissipate into the air the way the device was designed. The heat built up inside the blanket and the baby was burned. In the second case, twins with hyperbilirubinemia were being prepared for the heel stick procedure, and the heel warmer ruptured. Its contents came out and covered the infants. Now, it's non-toxic material, but it's hot. Right? It's designed to get hot to warm up the baby. Now, this is a case in which the burst strength would normally have been tested as part of the process validation. Right? But you can't do a burst test on every device before you ship it because that would destroy the device. So that's why it requires process validation. Case number 3, infant received a second-degree burn when the device was reused and reheated, contrary to labeling instructions. What happened was the phlebotomist or nurse used it once on one baby and then put it in a microwave oven. It got too hot and burned the baby. Fourth case is another burst instance, only now the infant wasn't hurt, but the nurse required emergency eye wash and ophthalmic antibiotics. So the nurse was hurt. Again, this is a process validation instance. All right, now we've got that example in mind. We're going to look at the definitions that go into 14971, and we're going to follow this process utilizing our system. So what goes into risk? So this is the overall picture. And this is a good picture to help you understand how all of this fits together. So you're going to identify hazards. And hazards are going to be associated with a sequence of events. When the sequence of events happens, then we move from hazard to a hazardous situation. This is a potential to be harmed. When somebody actually encounters the hazardous situation, they do get harmed. And we're going to count harm as it's going to have a severity of the harm and a probability of occurrence of the harm. And we're going to combine them to estimate risk. Now, there's a couple of factors that go into probability. The probability that the hazardous situation actually occurs, and then the probability that the hazardous situation actually leads to harm. So there's going to be some issues here. And what is really going on is that we're going to use severity and probability to estimate risk, and so that's why we're interested in them. And we're going to look at severity, and we talked about burns already. So burns have a nice severity classification, first, second, and third degree. Burns have various levels of severity, and so if we're interested in a first-degree burn, then we might talk about the probability that a first-degree burn is the harm. We might talk about a second-degree burn, and it's going to have a different probability because second-degree burn is less likely, we would like to think in most instances, to happen. So first-degree burns might be more common, second-degree burns less common, third-degree burns extremely rare, we would like to think. So the severity and the probability are going to go together. We're going to combine them in our method to estimate risk. Now, here's the definition of a hazard. It is a potential source of harm. So what this means is something could go wrong. And so the manufacturer is going to identify device hazards, and they're going to do them in normal and fault conditions. And they're going to identify known and foreseeable. Now, what's really important here is that many people get confused and think that they should be analyzing only fault conditions. But the device can cause a problem when it operates normally. So the patient could get harmed as a result of a device that's operating normally. A couple of examples. If there's a use error, in other words, somebody misinterprets the device functions properly, but it gets applied incorrectly, then that is a normal condition in the sense that the device is not in a fault condition, but there's still harm. So you got to worry about those kinds of things. So the unit of analysis here is not the fault, it's the harm, and they can happen in both normal and fault conditions. Now, the FDA, in our example, identified a couple of hazards, right? Excessive heat, rupture, chemical spills, improper reuse. These lead to hazardous situations. These are circumstances in which a people, property, or the environment are exposed to the hazard. Right? So the hazardous potential, and it doesn't arise until it's set off by a sequence of events. It then becomes a hazardous situation that allows exposure to the hazard. The hazardous situation can occur in normal operation or in fault conditions. So what we have here is a couple of sequence of events. Excessive heat, chemical mix is incorrect. Use of the blanket contrary to manufacturer's instructions. Rupture, incorrect seal strength. Now, we would analyze these even further. Improper reuse, contrary to manufacturer's instructions. Now, what's a harm? So it is the physical injury or damage to the health of people or damage to property in the environment. And people in this case could be the patient or the user. So harm is the actual injury that happens. And so in our excessive heat, it's thermal burn. In the rupture, it could have been a thermal burn or it could have been a chemical burn. Improper reuse, some of those same harms can occur. So a given harm might occur in a variety of different ways, starting from a hazard, different sets of hazards and sequence of events, hazardous situations, sometimes lead to exactly the same harm. Right? There's lots of ways you could get burned, for example, on some medical devices. All right, now we're interested in severity. So this is a measure of the possible consequences of hazard. And so when harm occurs, it has some levels of severity. Now, you as the manufacturer have to define these levels of severity, and we're going to talk about them. And it's usually done qualitatively. You're usually going to have a description that identifies the severity of the harm. Similarly, with probability of occurrence, this is the likelihood that the harm occurs with the stated severity. So for every stated severity, first degree, second degree, third degree burn, for example, I'm going to associate a probability of occurrence, the likelihood that this is going to happen. Again, it's almost always going to be qualitative. It looks like I ought to be able to get some good numbers here, but in practice, that really doesn't work. Usually don't have enough information to get the numbers, and even if you do get some kind of numbers, there's usually they're not exact. They're estimates at best, so there is some variability associated with the numbers. Most people end up relying upon a qualitative method. Now, we're going to combine these things to get risk. And so risk is the combination of probability of occurrence and severity of harm. And usually what happens is people do some kind of multiplication table. I'm giving you a very simple example here. Severity of harm could be negligible, moderate, or significant. The probability of occurrence could be high, medium, or low. Now, for each one of those terms, I'm going to have a descriptor so that I have my risk management team apply them uniformly for every hazard that they analyze. All right, so now, how do we develop this risk management plan? It depends on what our quality management system looks like. So it's the overarching approach to manage risk, and I could find it as a standalone document, perfectly fine. For every project, I write a separate risk management plan. Maybe I don't need a separate risk management plan for every project, so maybe sometimes it's integrated into quality management system documents. Sometimes I can refer to other documents, so maybe it is a structure with pointers to other areas. As long as I've got something that I can identify as the risk management plan, and it's got the required elements, I can do it any way that works in my company. Now, I have to identify the scope of the plan, and so here's a simple example. On the left-hand side, I've indicated the life cycle of the infant heel warmer. And so we're going to, in the boxes in the middle, design and develop, do process validation, enter into production, pick, pack, and ship, put it in the warehouse in the hospital, activate it, apply it to the neonate, and dispose of it. On the right-hand side, I've taken that same life cycle and divided it up into the elements of the risk management flow. So risk and assessment and control, collecting production information, and collecting post-production information. Now, what I need to do next is assign responsibilities and authorities. So it's basically who has approval authority, who is responsible for investigating issues, and so on. My recommendation is that when you do this, you usually have an associated design project. And so assign the roles so that they're commensurate with the roles you've assigned in the design project. It just makes it a lot easier for everybody. And there's an interesting tool called the RASI matrix, in which in the RASI matrix, for every task or responsibility, you identify who is responsible to get it done, who has the authority to approve it or veto it, who supports the person that's responsible to get it done, and who needs to be informed about the progress of the activity. Support is usually a two-way communication. The responsible person needs the help of the support people. Inform is usually one-way communication. The responsible person is providing a status report to the people that get informed. So the RASI matrix is a very powerful tool here. Now, you need criteria for risk acceptability. So the plan calls for two sets. One is from the risk associated with each hazardous situation. So remember, we went from hazard to sequence of events to hazardous situation to harm. Harm is estimated. Harm has severity and probability. We combine them to get risk. And then we ask the question, what risks are acceptable? The risk acceptability is defined in the risk management plan. Similarly, we're going to have to define overall residual risk. After we've reduced all of the risks associated with each hazard, we need to step back and look at what's going on with the whole device. It has some residual risk called the overall residual risk. What is the acceptability criteria there as well? Now, we've been talking a lot about risk, so here's another view of how it fits together. So one of the things that we might do is imagine risk as on a plane. And so what we have is this plane divided up into regions. And I've divided these regions using a recommendation from 14971. The risk management plan section tells you how to do this, and it's got some notes. And the notes recommend that this is how you divide things up, that you first of all divide risk into two regions, acceptable and unacceptable. And then you divide the acceptable region up into two subregions, things that are acceptable after you've done risk minimization, and things that are acceptable because the risk is negligible. In other words, it's so small that there's nothing that you have to do. So this is the way the standard recommends that you divide regions. You often see a bunch of different ways to do this, but this is what the standard recommends. And oh, by the way, if you understand this model of how to do it, you'll understand the objections that are coming out of the European Union version, because they're objecting to this specific, to some consequences of this specific model. All right, now we can think of this as a plane, but in general, that's really hard to work with. So it usually becomes a table. And so here are some descriptors of severity and probability. I told you they're most likely going to be qualitative, which means we're not going to assign numbers to them. We're going to assign descriptive phrases. So these are going to be attributes. And what we're interested in here is enough description that the members of your team can apply these terms uniformly. So this is pretty hard in order to get enough description into these terms so that everybody can use them in essentially the same way. Now, once we do this, we have our probability levels, we have our severity levels, What's going to happen next is that we're going to take every combination and assign it to a risk. So this is where we're going to decide on our risk. And I've used the previous model, acceptable risk as low as, I've used a slightly different model here. Acceptable risk as low as reasonably practicable and unacceptable. However you classify them doesn't make much difference. What's important is that in the end, you're going to be able to identify those risks that are acceptable and those risks that are not acceptable. Or to put it another way, you're going to identify the cases where you have to do risk reduction and the cases where you don't have to do risk reduction. Now, you're going to look at overall residual risk, and you'd like to think that if every risk is low, the sum total of them is going to be low, but there is going to be some residual risk, and you got to evaluate it with knowledge of the device. If the overall residual risk is too high, then it's maybe offset by the medical benefits. So here's an example. X-rays produce tissue damage, but the information we obtain from the diagnostic X-ray is going to outweigh the risk of tissue damage, particularly if we control X-ray dosage, as an example. Now, we're going to do verification activities, and the standard tells us there's two different kinds. The first is we're going to make sure that the risk control measures are actually implemented in the final design. All right, so this is really, really important. And then the second part of verification is to answer the question, will they really work? In other words, if they're implemented, are they actually going to reduce the risk? And the risk management plan explains how you're going to do that in your company. And there's a variety of ways to do it, but the risk management plan is going to be the place where you pick the methods and you define how you're going to do this work. You're going to explain in the risk management plan how you collect production activities and monitor them and utilize that information to determine risk. So a couple of examples. If the production activities are not done correctly, you've got some potential problems. And so one of them that I always worry about is validated processes. In a validated process, as I said, nobody is able to check the device before it ships, so you need to worry that the validated processes are being run correctly. And I've got a couple of examples here about what could go wrong. Now, you're going to get into post-production activities. What's going on amongst the users after you've shipped the product? So production is while you're making it. Post-production is you've made it and you've shipped it. It's on the market. What can you learn from all of the areas where you can collect information? Customer complaints, installation and servicing reports, adverse event reports. The FDA has got a nice database called TPLC in which you can look up recalls and adverse events all on one page. It's really valuable. You can find it on the FDA website. Just go to the search engine and put in TPLC and you'll get to the databases. For every item that you're going to collect, you're going to review the hazardous situation and risk and to decide whether or not you need to update the information. All right, now you're going to do risk analysis, and this is what's going on here. This is a systematic approach to determining risk. So you're going to list every hazard. You're going to list associated hazardous situations that result from chain of events. All right, so you're going to have the hazard, the chain of event, and the resulting hazardous situation. From there, you're going to identify the potential harms, estimate severity and probability, and then calculate the estimated risk. And the risk management plan is going to tell you how to do that calculation. Now, here's an example if you use the spreadsheet model. So the hazard is a burst pouch. The chain of events, operator error setting up the sealing machine, resulting in a weak seal. The nurse aggressively mixes the pouch. Hazardous situation, pouch spills hot contents. Potential harms, second-degree thermal burn, and I've got serious probability and estimates of risk. So this is often the way that you're going to set it up. Now, identifying hazards can be really difficult. So the standard gives you some help in doing that. So Annex C gives you device characteristics that could impact safety. So you want to answer all of those questions. And as you're answering the questions, you want to ask yourself, what hazards could occur, what am I identifying as hazards as I'm answering these questions. So don't just answer the questions. The idea is that they're driving you to think about what's going on. There's a couple of tables that give you potential hazards, potential initiating events. So this could be the first step in the chain. And then examples of how all of this fits together, hazards, chain of events, and situations. And if your device is in vitro diagnostic, there's a couple of other things that are going on. So Annex H is going to give you some help in that area. Then you're going to evaluate the risk. So the risk management plan tells you what risks are acceptable and what risks require risk reduction. So risk analysis is going to estimate the risk. I'm going to put those two things together to ask the question, when do I need to do risk reduction? Here's my picture again. So what's going on here is I'm in risk evaluation. So I'm answering the question, do I need to do risk reduction based upon the combination of the estimated risk and the criteria that I've established in my plan. And if I have to do risk control, this is how it works. There's a number of steps we're going to go through. The first is we're going to identify all of the options available to us, and we're going to apply the options in hierarchical order. So first of all, we're going to do safety by design. Then we're going to do protective measures. Then we're going to do safety information. So what this means is that it doesn't necessarily mean we've got to do them in this strict order, but if we have a choice between safety by design and a protective measure, we should choose safety by design. If we have a choice between a protective measure and just information for safety, like something in the instructions for use, we should choose protective measures. Then we're going to implement our choices. We're going to verify implementation, record the results in the risk management file. After implementation, we have still some risk left over. We're never going to drive the risk to zero. That's residual risk. So then we're going to ask the question, is the residual risk now acceptable? If it is, we can move on. If it isn't, we're going to loop back through this process until we get it to be acceptable, or we determine that we can't make it acceptable, in which case then we're going to look at benefits. So then we're going to do a risk-benefit analysis in an attempt to answer the question, what do I need to do? We're going to answer the question, does the benefit of this medical device for this hazard I'm analyzing outweigh the risk associated with that same hazard? And then when I get through all of that, I'm going to ask the question, have I introduced any new risks? Because remember, I've had to change the design. Risk reduction means something is different after the risk reduction activities than before it. And when I change something, I have this potential question, I have this question to ask, have I introduced something new as a result of the change? Have I introduced a new risk that I don't need to analyze? And then finally, we're going to do a completeness check. Have I looked at all of the hazardous situations? Have I considered them? Have I understood all of their interrelationships? Now, we're going to look at evaluation of overall residual risk acceptability. And this is a really broad view. So we've been looking at individual hazards. Now we're going to step back. We're going to look at a bigger view, and we're going to ask the question about the device as a whole. So not at the individual hazard levels, but at the total devices as a whole. We're going to ask the question, is the overall residual risk acceptable? We're going to use expert opinion to do this review and decide what's going on. So the first question is the overall residual risk acceptable? And I know what counts as acceptable because I defined it up front in my plan. If the answer is yes, I'm going to decide what to disclose. In other words, what does the user need to know? If the answer is no, it's not acceptable, then I'm going to do a risk-benefit analysis. And the risk-benefit analysis is going to answer the question, do the benefits outweigh the risk? If the answer is yes, I'm going to go to disclose. If the answer is no, my recommendation is to seriously consider stopping the project. You now have a high-risk device for which you cannot justify the risk based upon its associated benefit. This is not a device you want to put on the market. There's a very strong possibility that somebody's going to get injured, there's going to be harm, you're going to get sued, and the suit is going to discover that you could not reduce the risk, and you could not demonstrate that the benefit outweighed the risk. So this is a very dangerous situation. Now, how do we disclose residual overall residual risks? Well, Annex J gives us some information on communicating risks, and so it has this idea that we have safety information, which is the least preferred method, and so we need to identify who receives this information and how they're going to get it. Explain the risk, the consequences of exposure, and how to keep the harm from happening. So that's what we need to do when we disclose risk. Now, we're going to turn our attention to this guidance document. This is very valuable because it is going to explain how to integrate risk management in a quality management system. 14971 says that you don't have to have a quality management system to have a risk management system. So it treats quality management and risk management as two independent standalone systems. Now, hardly anybody does it that way. They like to integrate them because they're doing a lot of related activities, and so the GHTF guidance document gives you some advice about how to do that. So it focuses on this integration question and addresses this problem in the scope of 14971 that says you do not have to have a quality management system in place. However, risk management can be an integral part of quality management. So that's what the GHTF is trying to get us some guidance on how to make that happen. Now, GHTF was working for a long time on integrating and creating uniformity amongst national regulatory bodies for medical devices. It was organized in study groups, and the study groups published guidance documents. And the idea was that countries in their regulatory system would pick up the guidance documents and get them implemented. Now, GHTF morphed itself into a new organization called the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, IMDRF. And IMDRF has all of the old GHTF guidance documents on its website. So you can go to that website, you can find all these guidance documents, and you can download them all at no charge. So all the GHTF guidance documents are there, as well as new guidance documents that IMDRF is developing. So this is the document that I've cited here, implementation of a risk management principles and activities inside a quality management system. And so the guidance here defines 4 phases of risk management. So first of all, and this is going to line up quite nicely with 14971. So acceptable levels of risk. So we're going to identify what's acceptable. This is the risk management plan, one of the required elements in the risk management plan in 14971. And then we're going to analyze hazards in normal use and foreseeable misuse, and then we're going to estimate the risk for each identified hazard. We're going to compare the risks to our acceptability criteria. Right? So in the first phase, we developed the acceptability criteria. In the second phase, we estimated the risk using our standard approach. In the third phase, we're going to do this comparison and determine appropriate level of risk reduction. And then we're going to implement those risk reduction activities. And then finally, we're going to do risk control and monitoring. And so we're going to modify the device, and then we're going to look at all these activities throughout the device life cycle to help us decide whether or not we have managed to reduce the risk to an acceptable level. Now, the guidance covers a lot of areas in the quality management system, including all of the ones that I've listed here. But there are 2 that are of particular importance that I want to focus. The first is design and development. So this guidance document covers every area of design and development. So that's really important. And they do it in detail. So Appendix B has a detailed flow chart that shows the interrelationship between design control and the risk management process. So this is going to be very useful for you to get an integrated system implemented. Then on the corrective and preventive action, the guidance document contains a detailed flow chart that integrates risk management into the corrective and preventive action process. And so it identifies a number of areas that are key quality data points. Service reports, product complaints, nonconformities in manufacturing, engineering, and in the quality system. So all of those things are going to fit into the corrective and preventive action system, and all of those are going to have a potential impact on risk management. All right, so what you want to do is implement 14971 as written, and you want to integrate it into your quality management system. And to do that, you want to utilize some of the ideas from the GHTF guidance document. Now, there's a couple of tools that are quite useful, so we're going to look at 3 of them here in order to help understand what's going on. The first one is failure modes and effects analysis. Now, I'm going to warn you again. Very often, people make the mistake that they should be analyzing failures instead of hazards. And remember, hazards can occur in both normal and fault conditions. So if you analyze only failures or fault conditions, you're missing some significant portion of risk in your medical device. And what often happens is that people use the FMEA, which is a tool to help you with hazard analysis, instead of doing the hazard analysis. So they mistake the tool for the technique that they're supposed to be using. Now, FMEAs come from reliability, and there the issue is the fault, right? What you're trying to do is understand how often things fail and the consequences of these failures. So FMEA is a good risk management tool, but it's not going to be a complete risk management system. It's going to help you identify failures, and those failures can then turn into hazards. Right, so, but that doesn't mean that all hazards are failures. There are hazards that are not failures and not going to show up in the FMEA. Now, it's usually done in a giant spreadsheet model. Every row represents a hazard, and here's a common set of column headings. And so what you're going to do in the FMEA is you're going to get at the very basic levels components or at least functional parts of your medical device, and you're going to analyze them and try to understand what's going on in these columns so that in the end you understand how bad things can get. Oftentimes that's the risk priority number. Mitigation is what are you going to do to reduce the impact of this fault, who's responsible, and how are we going to make sure the verification step that it actually got implemented in the device. So that's very important. Now, another very great tool is fault tree analysis. This is a logic diagram showing the path to an event. The event under study is called the top event. The cause of the top event are diagrammed using standard logic symbols, and here's an example of what they might look like. So the AND symbol says that the output event occurs when all of the inputs occur at exactly the same time. The OR is an output event that occurs when at least one of the inputs occurs. Right? So I have this concept of AND. They all have to happen together. I have this concept of OR. At least one of them has to happen. And what I can do is analyze something that the literature calls a top event. Right? So I'm interested in understanding when something happens. And this is a fault tree. So I could have, as a top event, a hazard, but here I happen to have a fault. The pump fails. So what could cause the pump to fail? Right? So below that I've got an OR gate. Right? So I could have a bearing failure, a motor failure, a seal failure, or a valve failure. And what could cause the motor to fail? I could have a failure in a coupling, or I could have an electrical failure to the motor. What could cause an electrical failure to the motor? I have a power failure. In other words, I don't get power out of the AC mains. And the device runs on batteries, and the batteries are exhausted. So what I can do is utilize this to answer the question, what are all the combinations of things that can cause the pump to fail? And then what I'm interested in is recognizing that this, in essence, is going to help me diagram the chain of events. If this is associated with a hazard, that's going to give me the hazardous situation. And if I want to reduce the probability of it happening, I've got to break something in that chain. So the fault tree is a very valuable tool in that area. Now, there's another tool called HACCP, Hazard Analysis and Critical Control Points. And it's used by FDA and the Department of Agriculture as good manufacturing practices in food. So some food products from FDA and also USDA require that this HACCP concept to be implemented as good manufacturing practices. And it's based upon these so-called 7 principles. They're really steps about how to set up the system. So I'm not going to go through them in detail, but first of all, you're going to develop some kind of hazard analysis. You're going to figure out what could go wrong. And then you're going to determine where you're going to put controls in. Those are going to be critical control points. You're going to establish limits for the parameters that you're monitoring at those critical control points. Then you're going to establish monitoring procedures. How am I going to monitor the parameters? And those are going to help us identify when the parameters go out of spec. Principle number 5, we're going to establish corrective actions. And this is one thing that I really like. You're going to do this analysis, and you're going to put a corrective action in place in advance. So you're going to think about what corrections and corrective actions you're going to put in place before the problem happens. And oftentimes in device manufacturing QMSs, I don't see people take this approach. But here, you develop a list of all of the corrections and corrective actions based upon the analysis. You're ready to go when one of these things happen. Then you are going to establish verification procedures. How do you know that you followed the plan? And then principle number 7, you're going to establish record keeping and documentation. This is a classic quality management system. If you didn't write it down, it didn't happen. That's what the inspectors are going to look for. All right, so we're going to go to summary and conclusions. The standard method for medical device risk management is ISO 14971, 2007. FDA recognizes it as a consensus standard. The EU lists it as a harmonized standard to the 3 product directives involving medical devices. But remember, they are now changing it so that it applies. So that what they're saying is there's more restrictive language in the product directives than there is in 14971. So if you're selling into the European Union, you've got to use their version of which is EN-ISO 14971, 2012. ISO 13485, 2003 recommends using 14971 for risk management, and almost everyone does. In the United States, Canada, the European Union, everybody uses 14971 with some changes for the European Union. Its implementation starts with developing a risk management plan, and then we follow a series of steps. And they tend to be linear, but not really, in that we're doing a lot of back and forth through these individual steps. So we're going to do risk analysis. We're going to estimate the risk associated with every hazard. We're going to evaluate those risks against our acceptability criteria to decide whether or not we need to do risk control. If yes, we're going to perform our risk control activities. Then we're going to estimate our overall residual risk. So we're going to evaluate that against the criteria in our plan. Now we're going to write a risk management report that is basically the conclusion that we've done everything that we said we were going to do, and we have all of the pieces in place for the next step. And then we're going to enter the next step, production and post-production information collection and evaluation. And we're going to maintain all of this in one risk management file. Now, the risk management file is not necessarily a static document. Up until the report, up to and including the report, it defines what's going on in the design phase. But then we can update it with production information, and we can update it with post-production information. And so we're going to take this new information and go back and answer the question, were our estimates in the design phase correct? So it's going to cycle back and help us calibrate the original estimates that we made. So 14971 is the de facto standard for medical device risk management. Regardless of our marketing region, it's really, really valuable. And it is most effective when it's integrated into a company's quality management system. Do that through the Global Harmonization Task Force guidance document. All right, now I'm going to turn it back to our host, who is going to tell you how to ask questions.
Thank you, Dan, for the wonderful presentation. And I would also like to thank all participants for cooperating with us. Now it's time for the Q&A to begin, and I request all who have questions for our presenter to click on the raise hand option, which is a palm-like icon at the bottom of your participants panel. Ladies and gentlemen, this is to ask your questions verbally, or you can also post your questions in the Q&A panel so that our presenter can read it out loud and then answer it for you. And if for any reason you're unable to ask your questions using either of two means that I just mentioned, you can share your question with me through chat, and I shall pass it on to our presenter to answer it for you. In the meanwhile, ladies and gentlemen, I sincerely request you to share your feedback in the feedback form that will appear on your polling panel right now. This feedback form is just 8 questions, mostly multiple choice in nature, and it wouldn't take more than 2 minutes of your time to answer these. We would be grateful if you could stay back a little longer and complete this feedback for us. Okay, Dan, I don't see any question that's coming up from our participant. Before we could conclude today's session, do you have any final thoughts left?
Yes, I think I find that implementing risk management is a daunting task for a lot of people, and my recommendation is that you do it following the standard, but it's really important that you get it integrated in the quality management system. So don't forget the Global Harmonization Task Force guidance document. It's going to help you reduce the work level by having a nice integrated system.
Thank you, Dan. And ladies and gentlemen, just to inform you, if in case you come up with any questions even after today's session, you can send in your questions to me, and I will go ahead and pass it on to our presenter and get that answered for you. And I would also like to inform you, if any of you feel that your team members, colleague might benefit from this webinar, we are happy to inform you that it will be available in the recorded format, and you can purchase it from our website, or you can call on our toll-free number. We welcome your suggestions and feedback or on ideas on how we can improve our webinars. We look forward to having you with us again sometime soon. On behalf of our presenter, Dan O'Leary, and the Global Compliance Panel team, I'd like to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and I wish you a pleasant day ahead. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and Dan, thank you so much for your time this time.
Thank you.